We'll go ahead and be turning to Romans chapter 4. Romans chapter 4. We're going to be picking up in Romans chapter 4 here in just a moment. Romans chapter 4. Before we do, we're going to go over our outline. You'll notice I have a little bit different. I'm going to have the text up on the screen here in just a moment. We'll switch it over to the text on the screen and see how it goes this way. We may change it back depending on how it goes, but we're going to try it this way. This is how we did a lot of the book of Luke. We put the text on the screen like this. The book of Romans is the outline we have on the board before us. We're following a two main point outline. There are some sub-points that we'll get into here in a moment. But we really have two main points. And the first is focused largely on what the overall theme of the book of Romans is. And that is, the theme of Romans is what? Verse 17 of chapter 1. The righteous shall live by faith. So that's our main theme for the book of Romans, is about the righteous shall live by faith. And so here we're in a section in the first few chapters. We've gone through 3 chapters already. That is really Paul's more argumentative section, if you will. And that is, the early part of Romans is Paul making the argument about the righteous shall live by faith, or justification by faith through grace. And so that's what he's dealing with in the first, that should be 11, not 12, first 11 chapters of the book of Romans. 1 through 11 is dealing with the justification by faith through grace. And then section 2 is our application section, living as a Christian. And so in that section he talks about how we live as a Christian in our relationships with one another, in our relationships with the government, the relationship between the weak and the strong brother. And then he just want to make some closing remarks in 16, similar along the lines of those he makes in a lot of the books, Greek so and so, and some final exhortations in chapter 16. But we're still focused on section 1, again, that's 1 through 11, not 12, 1 through 11, justification by faith through grace. We have been, so far, studying through chapters 1 through 3, and concluded chapter 3 on Sunday morning, and those 3 chapters are about the need for justification. And so, if you recall, as we go back in the book, chapter 1 is about what? Chapter 1,
are we supposed to be able to read that?
I'm trying to get it to blow up here in the corner. The program will be easier to read when the full program is downloaded, but they wouldn't let me download it, so this is the web browser version of it. Let's see here. Anyway, let's just do this. Let's just do this. I didn't know how it would look. I've got the PowerPoint copy here. We won't have the text on tonight, and we'll see how it looks with the full program downloaded on Sunday, when it'll let me change the fonts of everything, but it won't let me change it in the web browser. So we'll just follow the outline. So the text won't be on the board tonight, but we'll see Sunday how it looks once we get the thing downloaded like we used when we followed through Acts, where it allowed me to adjust a little bit more. But in the outline we've been following, we've been talking about that need for justification in 1 through 3. So chapter 1 is the Gentiles need the gospel. Chapter 2, the Jews. The Gentiles need it, and the Jews need it, or the non-Jews and the Jews need it. In chapter 3, all need the gospel. The reason all need the gospel is because all have sinned. That's the point he's been making in the first 3 chapters. So chapter 1, the Gentiles sin, face the wrath of God. Because of that, they needed the gospel. Chapter 2, the Jews sin and face the wrath of God. Because of that, they needed the gospel. Chapter 3, the Jews and the Gentiles sin, all have sinned. And since all have sinned, all face the wrath of God, thus, all need the gospel. And so he's been pointing out so far, in the first 3 chapters as we discussed, about the need for justification. We're beginning section 2 this evening in chapter 4. Then we'll go through chapter 8, and that is about this justification is available to all. He's going to argue that mostly here in chapter 4. And as we go through some of the others, we'll be talking about some of the blessings and then answering some questions that are raised. But chapter 4 really is dealing a lot with that fact that it's available to everyone. He's alluded to that in chapter 3, that there is no distinction or difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. And Christ was set forth as a propitiation for everyone who believes. But he's going to talk about that over here in chapter 4. In just a moment, we'll get there. Then 9 through 11 is about the rejection of justification. That's focusing in on the Jews, or Israel's rejection of that justification that is available unto everyone. And so, chapter 9 through 11 will deal with that in more detail about them being rejected. I was having in the chapter. We're ready for chapter 4 now. Chapter 4, we've got a theme or a title that we look at at the start of these 4 chapters. And chapter 4 is about faith accounted for righteousness. We're going to talk about the term in a minute. It's a term that is sometimes misused because of what it can be translated. And so we'll talk about what this word account or accounted or imputed, as some translated, means here in just a moment. But that's what chapter 4 is about, is faith accounted for righteousness. This chapter divides down into just 2 major sections. If you've got your workbook in front of you, it'll be on page number 9 of your material. Page number 9 is the outline. Page 10 is the questions. Page number 9 is about faith that is accounted for righteousness. Now, let's go to question number 1. Briefly summarize the chapter. What's chapter 4 about? Besides, I guess I gave you some of the answer of this justification of faith accounted for righteousness, but what's chapter 4 about? Several key things he points out. We said that faith is accounted for righteousness. He's going to talk a lot here about justification, particularly in the first 12 verses. But this justification is by what? Works. Well, justification in the first 4 is by faith, not the works of the old law, as he's going to point out here in the early part of chapter 4. So it's justification by faith, not the deeds of the old law. And it is this justification by faith is available to each and every one. And so the outline we're following is 2 parts. Justification by faith, 1 to 12, available to all, 13 to 25. So it's about the justification by faith. Now, there are 2 main subsections we're going to focus in on the justification by faith. And so, that is that the justification is by faith. It is not by deeds. It is not by circumcision. Now, obviously, we would count circumcision as one of those deeds or works, right, of the old law, and throw it in that category. But these 2 are being focused on for 2 reasons. The Jews had a couple of main boasting points. 2 or 3 boasting points. One of the big ones being they would see of Abraham. And he's going to point out later on about those who would see of Abraham as obedient. But their boasting point, along with being the seed of Abraham, is they had the old law, and they were circumcised. And so what he's doing here in chapter 4 is, as he's already dealt with at the end of chapter 3, if you recall, as we end chapter 3, he talked about that when what becomes of our boasting, it is excluded by what kind of law? By law of works, no, but by law of faith. So he's talking about the law of having done, he's talking about having the works of the old law being done, or the works of faith. And justification is by faith. He says, for we hold that one is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. So that's important. If you highlight in your Bible, highlight that phrase there, apart from works of the law. Sometimes we hear the word law. The law may be referring to old, and it may be referring to new. We have to know what we're talking about. What's the context surrounding this chapter talking about? Because we're going to answer some questions here in chapter 4 about what these deeds are. If we go back into chapter 3, what law is under consideration? The old law. So, when we come to the end of chapter 3, and it's the law of faith, not a law of works, the point is, it's not by that old law. So when we get to chapter 4, he says he's justified by faith, not by works. The works of are we talking about? The works of the law of verse 28. And so, sometimes you'll hear people say that Paul and James contradict one another, and they'll come to this passage and say, you see, we're not saved by works. But so it's important in any text where it says we're not saved by works, or saved by, or we are saved by works, to go back and establish what's being talked about in the context. So, backing up to the previous chapter, what works are under consideration? The works of the law. What law are we talking about at that point? The Old Testament, the Old Law. So, the works of the law. Verse 29, or is the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles also? Yes, of the Gentiles also. Since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith, do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. That old law, we're not casting it aside, is making the point. The old law has been made out of the way, yes. But the point is that law served its purpose, and that law was fulfilled. Right? And so, that law has been fulfilled and has served its purpose. So they're not making these points to destroy the old law. Rather, that law has served its purpose, as Galatians would point out about being the schoolmaster in the book of Galatians. So it served its purpose. But justification did not come by the old law, because it wasn't by the works of the law. Now, let's establish this principle here, as he talks about works of the law and the law of faith. How was one justified? We've already pointed this out. We're going to revisit this again in a few minutes. How was one justified under the old law? By perfect keeping. Right? So when he talks about works of the old law, should they have kept what the law said? Absolutely. But the point is, they needed to be perfectly keeping. Had they perfectly kept, it would not then be considered grace, but a payment due. More about that in just a moment. So, we're still under that consideration as we come into 1 through 8 about these deeds or works that have been brought up at the end of chapter 3. So let's read 1 through 8 on this first section, and then we'll spend some time discussing. Verse 1 beginning. What shall we say, or what then shall we say was gained by Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. Just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. So let's begin at verse 1. Or the first couple of verses. Verse 1 and 2, what shall we say was gained by Abraham? Verse 2, if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about. Now we'll come back to verse 3 in a minute. Let's get down to verse 4. Why? Because verse 4, why am I something to boast about? The one who works, his wages are not counted as gift, but as his due. So, remember this point that we're establishing. Our main point in our outline. Chapter 1 through chapter 11. Justification by faith through grace. We'll revisit that here in a minute about grace. But for chapter 6, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? We're going to talk a lot about grace. If Abraham was justified by perfect keeping, which by the way, we're going to see in a second, the law wasn't even in place yet. But if he was justified by perfect keeping and never sinned, it wouldn't be counted as grace, but as what was due him. Think of the analogy he uses. To the one who works, his works are not counted as a gift, but as his due. You ever walked in on payday and thanked your boss for the gift when they hand you a check for the work you did? I mean, think about it. Have you ever seen somebody that walked in and they said, thank you for the gift you gave me after they worked long hours to earn it? No, because they put in the work, those wages were due them. Right? And that's the point he's making here in verse 4. the one who works is not a gift or grace, but it is his due. And Abraham was not justified because of perfect keeping. Now, James is going to take the same passage quoted here later on and talk about his works, because he believed and he obeyed. So there he did have to carry out on that obedience. Right? We know that from the story of Abraham, as James talks about it. We know, as Hebrews talks about, by faith what he did. But the point is, he wasn't justified by a perfect keeping. He was justified because he believed God. So back to verse 3. Verse 3. Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now, if you write in your Bible, if you're taking notes, you may want to write this out. There are three important passages to remember when we are considering what is being talked about here in Romans chapter 4. Because remember, justification is by faith. It is not by deeds. It is not by circumcision. That's what the Jews were boasting of. The deeds of the old law and circumcision. First passage to remember, verse 3, that's a quotation from Genesis chapter 15 and in verse 6. Genesis chapter 15 and in verse 6. Now, the other passage to consider, we'll get to the third one in a moment when we get down to the circumcision part. The other one is this. We are considering what works again? Works of the law, the old law. That law was given in Exodus chapter 20. So when Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, was well before the law was ever given. So it wasn't by those works of the old law that they want to boast of, but by faith. We'll prove that more in a minute with a quotation from David. I want to spend just a second here in verse 3 and talk about this word counted or accounted. Sometimes it is translated imputed. And so there are some that we talk about the imputation of sin and the imputation of Christ's righteousness. So just to summarize, the idea is when Christ died, our sins were imputed to him, and so he was a sinner when he died, and then his righteousness is imputed to us. So that's the idea of this word that many will take and misuse this word imputed, thinking of it sort of that Jesus really was forsaken on the cross, as he quotes from Psalm 22, that he really was forsaken because God doesn't hear sinners. That's the idea some have, that our sins were imputed to him or charged to him, and now his righteousness is all that's in us, and that is imputed to us. And you may hear that in many different terms, but that's a general idea. The word accounted, or count, or impute, does not carry with it that idea at all. And in fact, the word accounted, let me just say, what word do you hear in the word accounted? Account. So let's think for just a second about somebody that is in the field of accounting. And you may have several clients who are in the field of accounting, and you're helping keep the books, and you've got to figure out when something's done to put it down as a charge on an account, right? So you've got an account, and they've got when you're balancing your books, you're counting down the payment, if you will. So if you go to the store and you swipe your card, and then you get a receipt for $15, and you may balance your checkbook, right? You mark it down that you spent the money. The word count means to count, to calculate, to count, to enumerate. To set down as a matter of account, to impute, to account, to be set as not, despise, to regard, to deem, to consider, conclude, and several other things, as is defined by Mounts. If your finger here in Romans, I'm going to go to one passage that shows us the use of this word. Luke chapter 22. Luke chapter 22. And in verse 37. Luke 22, verse 37. For I tell you that the scripture must be fulfilled in me, and he was numbered with the transgressors. So, we're talking about our word here, meaning to this accounting term. And this accounting term that we're talking about, this word count, is the same word as Luke 22, verse 37, is number. That is, if you were walking by and you knew nothing about Jesus on the day of his crucifixion, what conclusion would you have reached? that he is a criminal, right? He was counted, you would count him with the criminals. The idea is, when it's accounted to him for righteousness, it's not this imputation idea that it's the righteousness of Christ, but rather by his living and being faithful, it is credited to him. It is accounted to him. It is on his account, if you will, that he is righteous. And so this term is going to occur a few other times in our text, verse 5, verse 6 as well. Verse 4, it's not counted. Verse 5, faith is counted. Verse 6, to whom God counts righteousness. And so it's important to understand, it's been just a second to understand that term, that word is sometimes translated impute or imputed is not the idea as is carried out by those in the religious world. The idea has to do with, it's an accounting term, and it's having down on the account. Verse 5 now. We already looked at verse 4, verse 5. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him, who justifies them godly, his faith is counted. There's our term again, counted as righteousness. So just as it was counted to Abraham as righteousness, to the one who does not work, but believes in him, who justifies them godly, the one that has the same kind of faith, their faith is counted as righteousness for them. Then he begins in verse 6 and says, just as David also speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness apart from works. Verse 7 and 8 now. Blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man whom the Lord will not count his sin. So let's go back here and visit something we talked about a moment ago. What was the only way under the old law they could truthfully be righteous?
Perfect keeping of the law.
Perfect keeping of the law. Now we know from Romans chapter 3 that all have sinned. Right? So with the exception of Christ, nobody perfectly kept it. So, for just a second, setting Christ aside as he was perfect, for everybody else, nobody ever perfectly kept it. But then in verse 7, David, and quoting here from David in Psalm 32, and 1 and 2, blessed are those whose lawless deeds are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord will not count his sin. So let's go back here and think for just a second. It's our word again that occurs in verse 3, 4, 5, 6, occurs in verse 8. In the first few verses, we're talking about counting as righteousness. Or if one works, it is counted, it is not grace, but it is what is due him. They're not counted as a gift if you work and you receive your wages, right? That's what is due you for your work. This is counted as righteousness. And then he makes the point in verse 6 that David speaks of the blessing of the one to whom God counts righteousness. Now, remember, from chapter 3, none are righteous. And the reason none are righteous is all have sinned. Now, he makes the point here that David makes the point about God counting righteousness apart from works. How do we know it's apart from works? Well, their sins are covered. Their lawless deeds are forgiven. You know what that tells me already? If their lawless deeds are forgiven and their sins are covered, you know what they didn't do? What did they not do if they had sinned? Perfectly kept the law. How do we know that? Because sin is a transgression of the law. But then he says their sin's not charged against them. So being their sin's not charged against them and it's forgiven, and it's as if it never happened, that means that something was accounted as righteousness. What Paul is arguing here is by one of the three things we talk about for how we establish authority. He's arguing by necessary inference. And that is, the only way to truthfully be righteous under the old law was by perfect keeping. Leviticus 18 verse 5. No one did that, again, except Christ. Yet David says they can be saved and their sins forgiven. Which means it had to be accounted as righteousness somehow. How was that? By God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. And so he's arguing here from Psalm 32 that we're justified by faith apart from the deeds of the old law because nobody really kept it. Yet, David said their sins were forgiven. So how is they counted as righteousness? By faith, just as talked about with Abraham. So, justification is by faith. It is not by deeds. It's by faith. Abraham believed God and was counted him for righteousness. It is not by circumcision. Now again, this is the thing as you read the New Testament, the Jews just keep going back to it. The Jews want to argue time and time again that in order to be saved, the Gentiles must be circumcised. Remember we had this chapter, we read this long discussion in chapter 15 of Acts about it. Time and time again, Paul has to write about the issue concerning circumcision. He had to build the last chapter, or a couple of chapters ago, with those that were circumcised outwardly, but not inwardly, because their focus was on the outward. They were arguing about those who weren't circumcised. And now Paul's going to make the point here in chapter 4 that your justification is not by circumcision. Verse 9 beginning. Is this blessing then only for the circumcised? Okay, let's stop for a second. What blessing? Verse 6 and 7, that their lawless deeds are forgiven, that their sins are covered, and the Lord isn't counted against them. That they are justified by faith. Well, wait a minute, the Jews are going to say, that's for the circumcised. That's true, but for the circumcised. Is it for the circumcised, only for the circumcised, or also for the uncircumcised? For we say that faith was counted to Abraham as righteousness. How then was it counted to him? Was it before or after he had been circumcised? It was not after, but before he was circumcised. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well, and to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. So, remember before, justified apart from the deeds of the old law. It's justification by faith. And we looked at what David had to say, and we pointed out that Abraham was justified, the law was given for hundreds of years later. But then, we have this here in verse 9 where he deals with the other argument of the Jews, as we already pointed out, the circumcision. And his question is, was the gift of justification by faith only for the circumcised? The answer is no. In fact, you could argue, I would argue, that if it was for the circumcised only, then it would involve the deeds of the old law. But he's already argued it's not mine. But he points out it's not for the circumcised. He goes back to the Old Testament and asks this question. Was Abraham's faith accounted for righteousness before or after he was circumcised? It was before. I told you there were three key passages to remember from the Old Testament. In verse 3, it's a quotation from Genesis 15 and in verse 6. The old law, those deeds of the old law was first given outside the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20 and given in the next several chapters on through Leviticus. The other key chapter, if you write in your Bible, or you're taking notes, you may want to write down, is Genesis 17. You want to write that out beside verse 9 and 10. We'll go to Genesis 17 with it for just a moment. Genesis chapter 17. What takes place in chapter 17 of Genesis? What takes place here? This covenant of circumcision. This is where Abraham will be circumcised. Now, if you do quick math, you know what you realize about chapter 17? It takes place after chapter 15. And not just, sometimes as you go through some of the Gospels and stuff, things may get in a different order, Gospel to Gospel. We know it's chronological here, and I'll give you evidence of that here in just a moment. Let's begin in verse 17. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am God Almighty, walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between me and you, and may multiply you greatly. Then Abraham fell on his face, and God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And I will give you and to your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. And God said to Abraham, As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskins, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generation, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not of your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. Any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people, and he has broken my covenant. So there in chapter 17, and 1 through 14, here's this covenant of circumcision given when Abraham was 99 years old. Now back up to chapter 16 for just a second. We're on chapter 15. But chapter 16, just read the heading. What takes place in chapter 16? Who's born in chapter 16? Not Isaac, that's later on, but Ishmael. So between 16 and 17, Ishmael was born. And as you go on later on, in verse 25 of chapter 17, Ishmael was 13 when he was circumcised. So when Ishmael was born, Abraham would have been about 86. Now go back to chapter 15. Remember 15 verse 6. He believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. When does this take place? Let's begin in verse 1. Verse 1 of chapter 15. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue, what? Childless. And the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. So the fact that Eliezer of Damascus is his heir at this point means that who's not been born yet? Ishmael, right? And then later Isaac, who is the son that was promised. So chapter 15 and verse 6 takes place more than 13 years before chapter 17. So, coming back to Romans chapter 4, we see all that for this point. Romans chapter 4. When was Abraham justified, or when was faith accounted as righteousness for Abraham? Before or after he was circumcised? Paul says it was before, and the evidence in 15 through 17 shows us, as we can point out, it was before. Right? We can see that recorded in Genesis as well, along with what Paul says here. So, it was counted to him before he was circumcised. So verse 11 then. He received the sign of circumcision as a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith while he was still uncircumcised. So you remember, as we read through Genesis chapter 17, and God says, here's my covenant with you, my promise to you, and here's what you are to do. And what he gives him in chapter 17 to do is to be circumcised, right? But again, that faith is already accounted as righteousness. Circumcision was a sign for the Jews of that covenant between God and Abraham. That was the reason circumcision was initially instituted in chapter 17, and the Jews from then on were to be circumcised. For the Jews, that would serve as a reminder of that sign. Now, was it commanded? Yes. But the point was it was to be a sign. It was a reminder for them of the covenant between God and Abraham. And we know the three promises, the land, the nation, and as we often refer to it, the spiritual seed. But as we focus on those first two, the beneficiaries of the land and the nation were the Jews. Everybody's a beneficiary of the spiritual seed. Through your seed, all nations of the earth shall be blessed. But of those first two, the Jews were the beneficiaries of the promise between God, of the covenant between God and Abraham. By trying to bind this, the circumcision of all the Gentiles, they were actually negating its importance of circumcision to the Jewish people as that reminder of the sign between God, of that covenant between God and Abraham. So they were actually negating the importance of the reason that circumcision was initially instituted as that reminder of the covenant between God and Abraham by trying to bind it on the Gentiles and making it their biggest issue in the New Testament. So, verse 11, it was a sign as a seal of the righteousness. The purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that righteousness would be counted to them as well. He's starting to make the point that, Lord willing, Sunday, we'll spend our time on in 13 at the end of the chapter, and that is this is available to everyone and not just to the Jews. Right, that was their point. Well, it's available only to the circumcision. We're the circumcision. It's available only to us. And Paul's saying, no. In fact, faith was accounted as righteousness before Abraham was circumcised. He says, the purpose was to make him the father of all who believe without being circumcised, so that the righteousness would be counted to them as well. Just as it was counted or uncounted to Abraham, it could be counted to the uncircumcised as well, not just the circumcised. And to make him the father of the circumcised, who are not merely circumcised, but who also walk in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. And so, Abraham, it was a sign that he was the father of the circumcised. They're not merely the circumcised outward, but those who walk by faith. Right? That Abraham was the father of those who are faithful. And so, he makes the point about the circumcision and that covenant there. As you go back and read back through that when you have time to go through a little slower in Genesis 17, and what all said about that covenant and him being the father of many nations, and his promise of the inheritance of the land, and that sign that was established, and what purpose that circumcision served in Genesis 17 for the Jews from then on. And they're trying to make it the point of, well, you can't be saved because you're not circumcised. And they were taking it, what its purpose was as that sign and trying to twist and misuse it. We'll really on Sunday, we'll pick up about, in verse 13, and go through the end of the chapter, finish chapter 4, and talk about this justification by faith. The justification that Abraham has. The justification that Paul's already talked a little bit about being available to all. Some more evidence of it being made available to all, Lord willing, on Sunday